Racist police officers arrest two black women and instantly regret it. In the dead of night, two powerful women in law enforcement find themselves caught between duty and a system that seems beyond repair. When a routine traffic stop spirals out of control, an explosive confrontation forces them to confront their darkest fears. Will they be able to fight back against a force determined to keep them silent, or will they become victims of a corrupt system themselves? What happens when justice itself is put to the ultimate test? Let's stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the empty streets as the headlights of the patrol car sliced through the darkness. Inside, the only sound was the soft hum of the engine and the faint crackle of jazz music playing softly on the radio. The night was quiet, almost unnervingly so, with only the occasional flicker of a streetlight and the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt. Sarah Mitchell sat behind the wheel, her hands steady, but her mind was far from calm. She was a woman of few words, especially after a long and exhausting day, but tonight the silence felt heavier than usual. It wasn't just the fatigue from the meeting they had just left, a meeting that had been fraught with tension and frustration about the difficulties of implementing police reform. No, tonight something else was gnawing at her, a feeling that she couldn't quite shake, a sense of unease that had settled deep within her chest. Beside her, Emily Thompson was staring out the window, her arms folded across her chest. Emily was the kind of person who wore her confidence like a second skin, but even she seemed subdued tonight. As the head of investigations, Emily had seen it all, the corruption, the injustice, the systemic failures, but this was different. She, too, had felt the weight of the conversation they had just walked away from. "Do you think they'll ever listen?" Emily's voice broke the silence, low and thoughtful. Sarah exhaled slowly, her eyes never leaving the road ahead. "They have to," she replied quietly. "But it's not just about listening. It's about action. And that's where we keep hitting the wall." The two women had been in the force long enough to know how hard it was to break through the barriers of tradition, of ingrained biases, of years of systemic injustice. They were both successful, both women of color in a male-dominated profession, but even their positions couldn't shield them from the weight of the system they were trying to change. Emily sighed, her fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. "I just feel like we're up against something bigger than us. Every time we try to push for reform, it's like we hit a brick wall. And worse, it feels like they're waiting for us to fail." Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She understood. She knew how hard it was to stand tall when the very system you were trying to reform constantly pushed back, but she refused to let the weight of that defeat her. "We don't give up," she said, her voice firm. "We just have to keep pushing." The car cruised along the darkened highway, the faint hum of the tires filling the space between their words. As they neared the edge of town, something in the air seemed to shift. The stillness of the night grew more oppressive, more suffocating. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. Suddenly, the sharp flash of blue and red lights flickered in the rearview mirror. The silence in the car shattered, and both women's heads turned instinctively toward the mirror. "Damn it," Sarah muttered under her breath. She knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't unusual for police officers to pull over fellow officers for routine checks, but something about tonight felt different. Something in the air felt off, and the way those lights blinked in the rearview mirror sent a shiver down her spine. "Stay calm," Emily said quietly, her voice low but steady, as she sat up straighter in her seat. Her eyes were scanning the darkened road behind them, her mind already shifting into officer mode. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't afraid, not really, but the sense of foreboding was undeniable. Something was about to happen. She could feel it. As the patrol car slowed, Sarah rolled down her window, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the door handle. She had been a cop for years, and she knew the drill. But this time, there was something more, something she couldn't quite explain. She glanced at Emily, who was now staring straight ahead, her jaw set in determination. The two women shared a fleeting look, a silent understanding passing between them. The cruiser pulled up alongside them, and Sarah could see the figures of two officers emerging from the shadows, Wilson and Cooper. Both of them were seasoned cops, but there was something about the way they moved, something about the way they approached their car, that made Sarah's instincts flare. There was no casualness, no friendly exchange. This was something more, something colder. Wilson, the senior officer, was the first to step up to the window. He had a stern expression on his face, his eyes scanning the interior of the car with a dismissive glance. "Evening, ma'am," he said curtly, his tone sharp. "License and registration, please." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "What's this about?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Wilson's eyes narrowed. "Routine check. License and registration," he repeated, his voice cold. Sarah didn't move to retrieve her documents immediately. She wasn't being confrontational, but she knew the importance of keeping control of the situation. Something wasn't right, and she wasn't about to be caught off guard. From the passenger seat, Emily remained silent but alert, her body tense as she scanned Wilson's movements. Cooper, who had been standing a few paces behind, now approached the window, his arms crossed, his gaze hard and judgmental. "You're holding us up," Cooper remarked sharply, his tone dripping with contempt. "I suggest you hand over the papers before we make this more complicated." A spark of tension crackled in the air. The exchange had shifted from routine to something more ominous. The officers weren't just performing their duties, they were testing something, pushing boundaries in ways that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Everything is in order," Sarah said slowly, her voice controlled. "But I need to know why we're being stopped." Wilson's lips twisted into a thin, patronizing smile. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, stepping back. But the way he looked at her, it wasn't just suspicion. It was something deeper, something more ingrained. A sense of discomfort crept up Sarah's spine. Emily shifted in her seat, her eyes locked onto Wilson's every movement. Both women knew something wasn't right. And then the storm broke. With a sudden, sharp motion, Wilson reached into the car and yanked the door open. Before Sarah could react, he was pulling her out of the driver's seat, his grip tight and aggressive. Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. "Hey!" Emily shouted, reaching to intervene, but Cooper was already there, shoving her back with a force that knocked her against the side of the car. "Stay out of it, Thompson," Cooper spat, his words venomous. "This is between us and your friend." The air was thick with hostility, with something darker simmering just beneath the surface. Both Sarah and Emily knew they were being treated differently, not because of anything they had done, but because of who they were. They were both women of color in a profession that had long been dominated by a very different kind of authority. And tonight, that authority was on full display. As Sarah was roughly pulled from the car, she glanced over at Emily. She saw the look of frustration in her partner's eyes, but also something more. A resolve. A determination that neither of them would back down. But they had no idea just how far this night was going to push them, and how it would change everything. The night had shifted. What started as an ordinary traffic stop had escalated into something much darker. As Sarah stood by the open door of her car, Wilson's grip on her arm felt like the first tremors before an earthquake. His fingers were tight, forcing her to step back from the vehicle. Emily's voice rose in protest, but Cooper was already there, shoving her back with such force that she nearly lost her balance. "Don't touch me," Emily growled, fury burning in her eyes. But Cooper wasn't listening. His attention was fixed entirely on Sarah, who stood still, trying to control her breathing, trying to stay calm. For both of them. "Take her to the back," Wilson barked at Cooper. "We'll search the car." Emily watched helplessly as Sarah was pushed toward the rear of the patrol car, her wrists bound tightly with handcuffs. She wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but the look in Wilson's eyes told her all she needed to know. The power dynamic had shifted, and they were no longer in control. Wilson's voice, low and dripping with disdain, sliced through the tense air. "You think you're special, don't you?" He was sneering now, his face twisted in condescension. "A couple of women, playing the reform card, trying to tell us how to do our jobs. You're not above anyone, Mitchell." Sarah clenched her jaw. She had heard this kind of rhetoric before, the dismissive tone that tried to undermine everything she had worked for. She had faced it in the academy, on the streets, and in the halls of the department. But now, it felt personal. He wasn't just challenging her position as an officer. He was attacking her very identity, and it stung more than she cared to admit. "I'm just trying to do my job, Wilson," Sarah said through gritted teeth, her voice controlled but firm. Wilson leaned in closer, his breath hot on her face. "Doing your job? Or playing the victim card?" He spat. "You people always think you're entitled to something more just because of your skin. That's what this is all about, isn't it?" The words hit Sarah like a slap across the face, but she didn't let them show. Not yet. "Get her in the car," Wilson ordered, his voice now colder, more menacing. Cooper was already pulling Sarah toward the back of the cruiser, his grip forceful. As Sarah was pushed into the back seat, her mind raced. What the hell was happening? They had no reason to stop them. No probable cause, no warrant. Nothing. This wasn't a routine check. This was something else entirely. Something driven by power, prejudice, and the kind of arrogance that came from years of being untouchable. Inside the cruiser, she sat still, fighting to control her breathing. Emily was just a few feet away, and Sarah could see the struggle in her partner's eyes, the frustration, the anger, the helplessness. Emily had been through her fair share of challenges in this job, but this was different. They weren't just being stopped for a routine check. They were being targeted, singled out, and treated like criminals for no reason other than their race and the fact that they were women. It wasn't just a stop. It was an attack. From outside the car, Sarah could hear the sound of the trunk being opened, and then the rustling of equipment as Wilson and Cooper began their search. The noise only served to heighten the tension in Sarah's chest, but she forced herself to stay calm, to focus on what she could control. The clock was ticking, and if they didn't act fast, this situation could spiral out of control. Suddenly, she heard Wilson's voice, raised in anger. "What's this?" he shouted. There was a brief pause, then the unmistakable sound of metal being clanked against concrete. "A registered weapon? Are you kidding me?" Sarah's heart dropped. She knew that gun. It was hers. Registered, legally owned, a part of her job for personal protection. But she hadn't even thought about it when they were stopped. The officers hadn't mentioned any reason for pulling them over. No flashing lights, no indication of wrongdoing, nothing. And yet, now they were digging through her car, looking for something to justify this unnecessary stop. Sarah could already feel her pulse quickening. If they wanted to escalate this, they were about to find the fuel to start a fire. She wasn't going to let them twist her intentions, to turn this into something it wasn't. Her eyes met Emily's through the rearview mirror. The intensity in Emily's gaze was unmistakable. They both knew what was coming next. The officers wouldn't just walk away after finding a weapon. They would use it as an excuse to make this situation worse, to take control, to assert their authority. A moment later, the back door of the cruiser was flung open, and Wilson's voice cut through the air. "You're under arrest," he said, as if he had all the authority in the world. "Handcuffs on her now." Emily sprang into action. "You can't do this," she said, her voice shaking with restrained rage. "She's a fellow officer. You have no grounds to arrest her." But Cooper stepped forward, blocking her path. "Move it, Thompson," he growled. "This is bigger than you." The handcuffs clicked into place around Sarah's wrists, and she felt the cold metal bite into her skin. She didn't resist. She didn't have the luxury of making a scene, not when it was just the two of them against the world. But she wasn't about to let them win either. "Unbelievable," Emily said through gritted teeth, her eyes blazing. "You're making a mistake." Wilson sneered, clearly enjoying his position of power. "You've had enough chances, Mitchell. Now you'll learn what happens when you try to break the rules." Sarah couldn't believe it. This was the world she had been trying to change. The system she had worked to improve. This was the ugly face of it. The force that was supposed to protect and serve, now using its power to oppress those who tried to make it better. "You're wrong," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the fury boiling inside her. "This isn't justice. This is power. And power is what blinds you." Wilson didn't respond, but the contempt on his face said it all. He was enjoying this, enjoying the rush of dominance, the sense of control over a situation he had no right to escalate. But in his eyes, they weren't officers. They weren't people trying to make a difference. To him, they were just women, just another symbol of a system he could manipulate for his own gain. As Wilson and Cooper continued to humiliate her, Sarah held on to one thing: the knowledge that this night, however painful, was going to end. And when it did, they would be the ones to bring the truth to light. She wouldn't let them win. Not now, not ever. But for now, she had to endure. The silence between Sarah and Emily grew heavier as the minutes stretched on. They both knew that the real battle was only just beginning. What had started as a routine traffic stop had quickly turned into a nightmare, and neither of them knew just how deep this night would go, nor how it would change everything forever. But there was one thing Sarah was certain of: they would get through this. They had to, because no matter what happened next, the fight for justice wasn't over yet, and she was going to make sure the world saw what was truly happening here. The air inside the precinct was thick with tension as Sarah and Emily were led into the holding area. The hum of fluorescent lights above them was a constant reminder that things were not going as they should. This wasn't just another night at the station. This was something much deeper, more insidious. Sarah felt the weight of the handcuffs digging into her wrists as she was placed into the interrogation room. Her pulse was still racing from the stop, but now, in the sterile cold of the precinct, a new anger was growing within her. It was quiet, but it was there, a fire building slowly, burning hot, waiting to be unleashed. Emily was seated next to her, her jaw tight, fists clenched in her lap. They both knew that the stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. This was about everything they had worked for, everything they had fought to change. Moments later, the door to the room opened with a harsh creak, and in walked Lieutenant Anderson. His expression was grim, his posture rigid, but there was something in his eyes that wasn't there before: uncertainty. It was a small thing, easily dismissed by someone who didn't know him, but Sarah noticed. The kind of hesitation that only came when a person was about to face a truth they hadn't been prepared for. "I'm glad you two are finally here," Anderson said, his voice flat, but with an edge that seemed to cut through the tension. "We've got a lot to discuss." He took a seat at the metal table, his gaze flickering between Sarah and Emily. "I've just been briefed on the situation, and to be honest, I don't know what to think. Wilson and Cooper have been on the force for years without incident. What's really going on here?" Emily spoke first, her voice sharp. "They stopped us without cause. They treated us like criminals. And they arrested my partner for carrying a registered weapon. This isn't just a mistake, Anderson. This is prejudice." Anderson looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "I understand your frustration, but arresting someone for carrying a legal weapon is hardly grounds for a lawsuit." Sarah could feel the tension rising as Anderson's words seemed to brush off their experience. "With all due respect, sir," she said, her voice controlled, "this is not just about the gun. This is about the way we were treated, the way they spoke to us, the way they've been treating us for years." The room fell silent for a long moment. Anderson didn't seem to know how to respond. He shifted in his chair, a sigh escaping his lips as he rubbed his temples. Finally, he spoke again, his voice a little softer this time. "I'll look into it," he said, but his tone suggested he was already planning to bury the issue. He looked at the door as if already wanting to leave. But before he could, the door burst open, and in walked Wilson and Cooper, their faces flushed with the kind of self-assurance that came from years of operating above reproach. They strode into the room with the confidence of men who were certain of their authority. "Lieutenant," Wilson began, addressing Anderson, "we need to talk. There's been some confusion, but we did everything by the book." He turned his attention to Sarah and Emily. "These two, they just don't understand how things work. We're just doing our job." Emily's patience snapped. "You think we're the problem?" She shot back, her voice rising with indignation. "You're the ones who overstepped. You're the ones who made an unlawful stop. You're the ones who twisted this whole thing into a mess because of your own biases." Wilson's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening with every word. "That's rich, coming from a pair of officers who think they can lecture us on doing our job," he sneered. Maybe you should spend less time trying to teach us about the law and more time following it." Cooper didn't speak, but the smug look on his face made it clear that he agreed with every word Wilson had said. They stood there, almost smug in their belief that their actions would be excused, their prejudices overlooked. But Sarah was done being silent. "That's enough," she said, her voice cutting through the rising tension in the room. "You have no idea what it's like to walk into a room and be treated like you're less than human. You have no idea what it's like to be judged because of the color of your skin, because of the uniform you wear. You think this is about a mistake? This is about something much bigger. This is about how you've treated us every single day, how you've treated people like us for years. And it needs to stop." The room grew still as Sarah's words hung in the air. Emily looked at her, a quiet nod of agreement passing between them. Sarah could see it in Emily's eyes, the determination, the fire to see this through. Lieutenant Anderson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I think we need to address this," he said, his voice barely a whisper, as if the weight of the moment had finally settled on him. "Sarah, Emily, I hear you. I do. And I know something has to change. But you're asking for things I'm not sure we're ready to tackle." But Sarah wasn't backing down. "What you're asking for is simple," she said. "Accountability, discipline, and a new way of thinking. If we don't change how we do things, if we don't address the root of this problem, your officers' behavior, then nothing will change. And more people like us will continue to suffer. You have the power to make that change, Lieutenant. You have the authority to make sure this doesn't happen again." Emily added, "We're asking for real reform. Training, yes. But more than that, we need to stop tolerating racism in the ranks. We need to start holding every officer accountable, no matter how long they've been on the job." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Anderson didn't say anything for what seemed like forever. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low but resolute. "I don't know if this will be enough," he said, "but I'll agree to your demands. We'll investigate Wilson and Cooper. They'll be placed on administrative leave while we look into this. And I'll personally make sure that we implement a new training program, one that addresses racial biases and promotes cultural understanding. It won't fix everything, but it's a start." It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Wilson and Cooper stood there, the smug confidence they had once carried now replaced by a mixture of frustration and disbelief. They had underestimated Sarah and Emily. They had thought they could intimidate them, that they could hide behind their position of power. But now, they were facing something far more dangerous than a couple of women. They were facing accountability. And for the first time, they seemed to understand it. The realization was slow, but unmistakable. The arrogance that had colored their every move started to fade, replaced by the cold grip of reality. They had made a mistake, and now they were going to have to pay for it. Sarah glanced at Emily. There was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction, just resolve, because she knew that this battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The first steps toward change had been taken, but they both knew that there would be more battles ahead, harder, more challenging, and perhaps more painful. But the road to justice had already begun. And this time, they were not going to stop until the truth was heard, until the system was forced to change. And no matter what it took, they would be the ones to see it through. The following weeks after the heated confrontation in the precinct were filled with tension and anticipation. Sarah and Emily had never expected change to come easily. They knew the system was slow to evolve, but they also knew that every small victory mattered. What had begun as a confrontation with two rogue officers had now expanded into a larger movement, a movement that sought to address the very core of racism and bias within law enforcement. Lieutenant Anderson kept his word. Wilson and Cooper had been placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation took place. But Anderson's commitment to reform went beyond mere disciplinary action. He implemented the changes Sarah and Emily had demanded, though not without resistance from some of the older officers. But there was a palpable shift in the air. Something was different. Maybe it was the realization that things could no longer be ignored, or maybe it was the awareness that the public's trust was no longer a guarantee. The first step toward reform was the launch of a comprehensive training program that aimed to combat racial bias within the department. The training would cover everything from implicit bias to how officers could better interact with the communities they served. It was a move that many thought was long overdue. On the surface, it seemed like a positive change. But Sarah knew that real change would take more than just programs and lectures. It would require deep, introspective work. For that, the department needed more than just theoretical knowledge. They needed real-world experiences. And it was time for Wilson and Cooper to confront their pasts. The first day of the training was both awkward and uncomfortable. The room was filled with officers of all ranks, from rookies to seasoned veterans, all seated at long tables. Sarah and Emily stood at the front, both acting as facilitators, their faces stern but hopeful. Wilson and Cooper were there, sitting in the back, their arms crossed, unwilling to show any sign of remorse or acknowledgement of the changes unfolding around them. It was clear they hadn't embraced the idea of personal growth. Not yet, anyway. The training began with a simple exercise, a video showing real-life interactions between police officers and civilians, many of whom were from marginalized communities. Some were tense, some were confrontational, but most were filled with fear or a lack of trust in the police. Sarah had seen these scenes 1,000 times, but they never failed to strike a deep chord in her. She could feel the weight of their silence, the years of injustice in every frame. After the video finished, Sarah asked the room to break into small groups and discuss what they saw. She watched as the officers exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others defensive. The conversation was stilted at first, but Sarah could see the cracks forming. This was not going to be an easy conversation, but it was a necessary one. As the group spoke, Sarah and Emily moved through the room, listening to the discussions unfold. Some officers openly admitted their ignorance. Others tried to defend their actions, pointing to the difficulty of their job and the danger they faced every day. But then, there were those who were silent, who refused to engage. It was Wilson who caught Sarah's attention. He was sitting alone, staring at the table in front of him, his eyes distant. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. Instead, he gave her a tight nod, as though finally acknowledging that this wasn't just some program he could ignore. He was beginning to see it, that maybe, just maybe, the way he had operated for so many years was wrong. A few days later, Wilson was the first to speak up during one of the group discussions. His voice was quiet at first, but there was a tremor of sincerity in it. "I've been thinking about a lot of what's been said these last few days," he admitted, his eyes scanning the room. "About what I've done, about how I've treated people. And I can't keep pretending that it's just part of the job. I've crossed lines I shouldn't have crossed." Sarah watched closely, the words hanging heavy in the air. She could see the conflict in Wilson's eyes. This wasn't easy for him. Admitting fault rarely was. But something had shifted. Perhaps it was the training, or maybe it was the quiet moments of reflection that had taken place in the solitude of his own thoughts. Whatever it was, Wilson was beginning to understand. "I've been part of the problem," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "I've been part of the system that makes it harder for people to trust us and harder for people to feel safe around us. I never really understood what that meant, what it truly meant, until now. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for Sarah, that was enough." Cooper, on the other hand, wasn't as open to change. He resisted the training from the very beginning, brushing off the exercises as nothing more than political correctness. He sat through the sessions with his arms crossed, his expression set in stone, as if daring anyone to challenge him. But Sarah knew better than to give up on him too soon. A few weeks into the training, the officers were required to spend a day in the community. The day was designed to let them step outside the confines of the precinct and see firsthand the challenges that civilians faced. It was one thing to read about injustice, but it was something entirely different to witness it, to listen to the stories of those who lived with its effects every day. Sarah and Emily took the group to a neighborhood that had been the center of multiple protests and incidents involving police misconduct. It was a working-class area, marked by crumbling infrastructure and the lingering sense that those who lived there had been abandoned by the system. The officers, including Wilson and Cooper, were tasked with talking to community members, not as authorities, but as human beings. It was here that Cooper began to crack. He had never been forced to listen before. He had never had to face the anger, the fear, the pain that lived in the streets he had sworn to protect. He wasn't just hearing stories anymore. He was hearing lives. One elderly woman, whose husband had been wrongly incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit, stood in front of him, her eyes sharp with the bitterness of years spent fighting the system. "You think you know what it's like?" she spat, her voice shaking with emotion. "You think you can walk into my neighborhood and tell me you're here to help? What have you done to help? What have you really done?" Cooper stood frozen, unsure of what to say. The woman's words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for the first time, he understood the depth of what he had been complicit in. The truth, raw and undeniable, settled into his heart. By the end of the program, both Wilson and Cooper had undergone a transformation. One that wasn't easy, and one that wasn't without resistance. They still had much to learn, but they had taken the first steps toward change. They began to see the responsibility that came with their badge, the weight of their power, and the impact they could have, not just in making arrests, but in making the world a safer, more just place for everyone. As they walked out of the training session together, Emily turned to Sarah. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" she said softly, her voice filled with determination. Sarah nodded, her eyes focused ahead. "Yes, but it's a good start, a necessary one." And they both knew it was far from over. But with each step, they were getting closer. Closer to a future where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality. The community was the missing piece to the puzzle. No matter how much reform was implemented within the police department, it would never work if the people they were sworn to protect didn't trust them. Trust had to be rebuilt, and for that, there was only one path forward: dialogue, empathy, and shared humanity. Sarah and Emily knew this better than anyone. After the training, after the conversations, and the self-reflection, the real work had begun. Now it was time for Wilson and Cooper to step out of the precinct and into the heart of the community they had once viewed through the lens of suspicion. They had to prove that they were more than just officers of the law. They had to show that they could be partners, advocates, and allies in a fight for justice. The first public meeting was held in a small community center at the edge of town, a place where many of the neighborhood's most vocal critics of the police gathered. Emily and Sarah stood at the front, flanking Wilson and Cooper, who looked more nervous than they had ever been in their careers. The room was filled with residents, young, old, black, brown, and white, all skeptical, some angry, but mostly waiting for something to change. Sarah opened the meeting, speaking calmly but firmly. "We're here today because things need to change. We want to hear from you, to understand your concerns, your frustrations, and your hopes for a safer, more just community." The room was quiet, but the tension was thick. People weren't ready to forgive, and they weren't eager to trust. But this was the first step, and it had to be taken. Sarah gestured toward Wilson and Cooper. "These two men are here not as your adversaries, but as people who have seen their own mistakes and are trying to make it right. They want to hear your stories. They want to learn how to do better." Wilson shifted uncomfortably, but Sarah had seen the change in him. He had begun to understand the importance of this moment. He stepped forward, his voice a little shaky but determined. "I'm not going to stand here and pretend that I've been perfect or that I understand everything you've been through, but I'm here to listen, to learn, to make sure things like this never happen again." It wasn't much, but it was a start. The room was still quiet, but the anger that had been so palpable moments ago began to soften, replaced by a curiosity, the first spark of hope that maybe things could change. Cooper stood next, his usual bravado absent, replaced by an uncharacteristic humility. I don't know where to begin," he admitted, his voice low, "but I do know that I want to do better. I want to help rebuild the trust that's been broken. It's not just about me or Wilson. It's about all of us. And I'm here to show you that I'm willing to work for that trust." The words hung in the air. No one spoke at first. Then, slowly, a woman in the back of the room raised her hand. Her eyes were red, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "You took my brother away. He was innocent. You didn't listen when we told you he was innocent, and you didn't care." Her words were heavy with the pain of years lost, of a life unjustly taken. The room went silent, the weight of her story crashing down on everyone present. Sarah looked at Wilson and Cooper. Wilson's face was tight with remorse, and Cooper looked like he might have to swallow back tears. This wasn't about policy anymore. It was about real people, real lives, and the consequences of the choices they had made. "I'm sorry," Wilson said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't know. I didn't listen. And I know that nothing I say can undo the hurt. But I'm here now, and I will listen. I'll work every day to make sure we don't make the same mistakes again." It was the first time anyone had seen Wilson truly vulnerable, and for a brief moment, the community seemed to take a collective breath. Maybe it wasn't too late to begin rebuilding what had been broken. Over the next few weeks, the meetings continued. Sarah and Emily organized a series of open forums where officers would sit with community members, listen to their grievances, and offer solutions. At first, these meetings were tense, full of anger and mistrust. But as Wilson and Cooper spent more time in the community, things began to shift. They weren't just showing up to apologize, they were taking action. They began to advocate for changes to the way the police interacted with the community, pushing for reforms that would allow for more accountability and transparency. But the real transformation began when they started to connect with the people they once thought of as the other. Wilson spent time volunteering at a local youth center, where he mentored young boys and girls, listening to their dreams and fears. Cooper worked with local business owners, helping them secure grants and funding for revitalization projects. Slowly, the residents began to see them not as the enemy, but as people who were actively trying to make amends. One day, during a particularly emotional meeting, an elderly man stood up. His hands shook as he addressed the officers. "I've seen a lot in my time. I've seen the police come and go, each promising change and each leaving without doing anything. But you're the first to sit with us, to really listen. I don't know if I can forgive everything that's happened, but I'm willing to try if you're willing to keep listening." The room held its breath, and for the first time in a long time, there was hope. Wilson nodded, his expression sincere. "We will listen, and we will act. We will keep working, not just for you, but with you." The progress wasn't fast. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Slowly, the seeds of trust were planted, nurtured by shared conversations, hard work, and a commitment to righting the wrongs of the past. The community began to see the officers not as an occupying force, but as people who were part of the same struggle, fighting for a better, safer future. And as the weeks passed, Wilson and Cooper's transformations were visible not just in their actions, but in the way they spoke. They no longer saw themselves as above the community, but as partners in the fight for justice. They began to understand that their role wasn't just to enforce the law, but to uplift the people they served, to empower them, to give them a voice. Sarah and Emily watched this transformation unfold with quiet pride. They had known that change would take time, but they had also known that it was possible. And with each passing day, they were proving it, to the officers, to the community, and to themselves. The program that started with Wilson and Cooper became a model for other precincts in the region. Other police departments, inspired by the success of the program, began to adopt similar community engagement initiatives. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. As Sarah walked through the community one evening, she overheard a conversation between two residents. One man was talking to his neighbor, his voice filled with newfound respect. "You know," he said, "I don't agree with everything the cops do, but they've been trying. They've been showing up, and that's more than I can say for most." It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was a sign that the community was starting to trust again, that the relationship between police and civilians was beginning to heal. And in the quiet of that evening, Sarah felt a small but significant hope blooming within her. Change was never easy, but with patience, persistence, and the willingness to listen, it was possible. And that, she realized, was worth fighting for. It had been months since that first public meeting, months since Wilson and Cooper had taken the hard, often painful steps toward redemption. And yet, despite all the challenges, despite the doubts that lingered in the shadows of the past, there was a sense of quiet pride in the air. Change was no longer an abstract concept, it was happening, right before their eyes. The police precinct, once a symbol of authority and control, had transformed. Sarah, Emily, Wilson, and Cooper had worked tirelessly to implement a series of reforms, ranging from updated training protocols to community-focused policing initiatives. The core of these reforms wasn't just to teach the officers the importance of accountability. It was to instill a new way of thinking. They weren't enforcers of a system. They were partners with the people they served, equal stakeholders in the fight for justice. Wilson and Cooper, now both respected within the department and the community, became symbols of what was possible. They were proof that change was not just possible, but necessary. Their journey wasn't just one of personal transformation. It had become a collective movement, a movement toward a more just, more accountable police force. Wilson sat in his office, the door slightly ajar, the hum of the precinct filling the background. He had learned a lot in the past few months. He had learned that humility didn't make him weak, it made him stronger. He had learned that standing up for what was right sometimes meant standing alone, and that admitting one's mistakes was the first step toward building trust. When he'd started in law enforcement, he had been eager to climb the ranks, obsessed with the power and prestige of the badge. But now, sitting at his desk, staring at the piles of case files and reports, he understood his role in a much deeper sense. He was here to protect, to serve, and to advocate for those who had long been forgotten by the system. His relationship with the community had changed, too. He had earned their trust, bit by bit, through his actions. Wilson had attended more community meetings, volunteered at more local events, and spent more time listening to the stories of those who had been hurt by the system. He knew that no amount of good intentions could erase the mistakes of the past, but it could certainly pave the way for a better future. And Cooper, too, had found his purpose. Once an officer who rarely thought beyond the call of duty, he now understood that his role extended beyond mere law enforcement. It was about empathy. It was about understanding. And, most importantly, it was about accountability. Together, Wilson and Cooper had become ambassadors for the changes within the department. They spoke to other precincts, shared their stories of transformation, and encouraged their colleagues to take the same path they had. What had begun as a personal journey of growth had become a movement, one that was slowly but surely rewriting the narrative of law enforcement in their city. Emily Thompson stood in front of a crowd once again, but this time it was different. The crowd was not filled with skepticism and anger. This time, they were here to celebrate. It was a public event held at the city's largest park, to commemorate the progress that had been made, to celebrate the rebirth of a relationship between the police and the community, one that was based on respect, trust, and a shared commitment to justice. Tonight, Emily began, her voice steady and full of conviction. We are not just here to celebrate reform. We are here to celebrate the fact that change is possible, that people can grow, and that justice can be achieved. We are here because we believe in the power of unity. Wilson and Cooper stood beside her, both looking at the crowd with a mix of humility and pride. It was Wilson who spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had endured together. When we first started this journey, Wilson said, looking out at the crowd, I didn't know how to get here. I didn't know how to change. But I learned that it doesn't matter where you've been. It's about where you're going. And I'm proud of the progress we've made, proud of the trust we've rebuilt. Cooper stepped forward next, his expression one of quiet reflection. I've made mistakes. We all have. But I've learned that being an officer of the law isn't just about enforcing rules. It's about enforcing fairness. It's about listening to the people who need to be heard, and it's about recognizing when we, as a system, have failed them. The applause that followed was loud, but it wasn't the loudness that mattered. It was the sincerity. For the first time, there was a genuine feeling of unity in the air, a belief that the officers standing before the crowd were not the enemy but part of the solution. The community wasn't just forgiving them, they were working with them. As the sun began to set on that evening, the scene was one of hope and possibility. People, young and old, approached Wilson and Cooper, shaking their hands, thanking them for their efforts, and sharing their own stories. Emily and Sarah moved through the crowd, talking to residents, hearing their concerns, and knowing that while this was a victory, the work was far from finished. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a sense of peace. The change they had all fought for, the change that had seemed impossible at times, was now beginning to take root. And though there would always be challenges ahead, She knew that the foundation had been laid for something better. The model that Sarah, Emily, Wilson, and Cooper had developed, a model that integrated reform within the police force with a commitment to community engagement and education, began to spread. Other precincts across the country took notice. They, too, wanted to replicate the success that had been achieved here. And while there were setbacks, as there always would be, the message was clear. It was possible to rebuild what had been broken. It was possible to change the course of the future by taking accountability for the past. It was possible to trust again. As the years went by, the city saw a dramatic drop in complaints against the police. The relationship between law enforcement and the community had become one of mutual respect and cooperation. The model developed by Sarah, Emily, Wilson, and Cooper became a symbol of hope, a beacon of what could be accomplished when people were willing to look beyond their differences and fight for a better future. And as Sarah walked through the neighborhood one evening, listening to the laughter of children playing in the park and seeing the bright smiles of people greeting each other, she realized something that had eluded her for so long. Justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And though the road had been long, the future was brighter for it. For the first time in her career, Sarah believed in the possibility of real, lasting change. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was progress. And for that, she was grateful. Because, after all, the ultimate message was simple. Change is always possible, no matter the darkness of the past. What mattered most was the courage to start, the willingness to learn, and the unshakable belief that a better world was always within reach.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.